Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. This week, we're going to talk about safety, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. When I first meet with a new client, we do informed consent so that they can set expectations and know what safety looks like and understand that safety is sort of, I want to say, the be all end all of what my work is about, and how sort of my clients and I think procurers, people who engage in the therapeutic process in general, have shifted over time, and why that's like a totally expected thing, and how capitalism is ruining it. That's my core thesis today. We'll see how many points I remember to make. Yeah, the idea of safety is really important. I would say core to therapy when we talk about things like confidentiality. The way that I talk about confidentiality, again, in my informed consent spiel, is that there are laws that protect what we talk about in therapy, so if people can feel safe talking about whatever it is that they're dealing with. If you're watching on YouTube, you're seeing me struggle with something in my eye. Contacts bugging me. Not great air quality still here in the Midwest. It's a real bummer. Got the scratchy throat, itchy eyes. Again, confidentiality is all about safety, and the thing that confidentiality breaks for, what people have to report and break confidentiality for, are safety concerns: intention to harm yourself, intention to harm somebody else, report of child abuse, or vulnerable adult abuse, right? Those things all have to do with safety. I literally say safety is my number one concern, making sure everybody I come into contact with is safe first and foremost. My informed consents really wrote at this point in my career. It's probably the fastest my clients ever hear me talk, as I just sort of rattle it off. It's a thing I've done for about 17 years that has changed and been updated over time, but not a ton. But the way that people are showing up in therapy and the way that people are talking about safety has definitely shifted. And I think for a lot of us therapists, initially, this was a good thing. I'm one of the people who does work with nervous systems and draws from a couple different schools of thought around complex trauma and how it affects your nervous system. That's a lot of what my work is, especially around religious trauma. Understanding how coercive control works in religious settings and how that isn't safe is important. Again, I talk about safety all the time still. But what's shifted is some of the branding around safety. And I think there's a historical through line in therapy and what's happening with, I think, modern sort of therapy talk. I did a whole episode about this a couple weeks ago. If you want to get primed or expand on the idea of how I think therapy talk's being misused, but we're really going to focus on safety. And I think, again, that is part of therapy talk that's being misused. One of the things that I noted and continue to note for my clients a number of years ago was there's a difference between being unsafe and being uncomfortable. And sort of the two parameters I think around this concept is we can certainly shift into the old boomer mentality of this generation's too soft. And that's unhelpful and inaccurate. And we can also go to the other end of the extreme, which is where I see a lot of my clients, especially young people, and the way that people talk about on the internet is veering in the other direction, where anything that makes us feel uncomfortable is unsafe. And we've sort of translated understanding our nervous systems into being evidence of being unsafe. And that's not really what our nervous system is for. It's a weird, again, sort of cultural hijacking of a scientific thing. And when I zoomed out and was ooh, that would be good to talk about, and zoomed out, what for me was the hook for this episode was there's a historical context here. We're taking something that allowed us to critique and be critical of some of the systems that we experience on a day-to-day basis in our modern society, and we're shifting the focus back to the individual. And that's a real flaw of therapy. Going back to the father of psychotherapy, Sigmund Freud, somebody who I've talked about a bunch in a bunch of different places. Freud got a ton of stuff wrong. Freud was a drug addict who wanted to sleep with his stepmom, and that's pretty much what he did. And I'm pretty skeptical of people who are still doing psychoanalysis. Now, I'm probably oversimplifying my critique of psychoanalysis to say Freud got pretty much everything wrong, so why are we still using Freud? Modern psychoanalysis is better than that. But again, like, I'm pretty critical of a lot of things that therapists are doing. Like, those people who are pushing enneagrams out and like, yo, that's just your updated, modernized version of the astrology, right? And I'm like pausing there because I know I'm going to offend a bunch of my neurodivergent, queer, tarot reading, pagan folks, but like, yeah, none of that's good science. So again, a horseshoe theory, right? If you go too far down the left critique or you go too far down the right critique, you sort of end at a place where, yeah, there's a bunch of biases. And we know this because like our brains are built for shortcuts. So of course there's biases. It's why something like having a pretty consistent practice around what is our own sort of ontological methods. How do we know what we know? And critiquing ourselves in that process is good. Again, I'm not like blindly saying science is flawless. I'm saying that good science helps keep our brains from falling into common shortcuts that our brain take and then make mistakes. And again, one of the shortcuts I see way too often online and in real life now is anytime we're feeling uncomfortable, that is unsafe. Part of the work trauma therapists have been doing for the past decade, I would say, longer for those people who are really in the know, but I would say therapy as a whole in the past decade is an awareness of our nervous system, paying attention to what our nervous system is signaling to us, because that's what it's doing. It's signaling, right? And sometimes when we're working with trauma, what happens when our system gets activated is we get flooded, right? And so when we talk about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, sometimes our brain moves into one of those responses and our brain is only interested and only capable of that one response, right? That's in essence what triggered originally meant. Now, our nervous system sends us these signals all of the time, right? And in a way that is either a misfire or is a tentative signal of, are we about to get in a fight? Do we need to do this? And again, what happens with a trauma response is sort of that signal cascades into taking action very quickly on an almost instinctual level. And again, I'm not dismissing that. I'm not taking away from that. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. Again, I'm not being a boomer about any of this, that like we need to toughen up and rub some dirt on it, right? Like I think that mind frame is harmful, but also veering into anything that elicits a response from our nervous system is also harmful, I think is not accurate either. Our nervous system is constantly on alert for threats, and sometimes it misfires on things that aren't threats. Sometimes it's just alerting us of a potential threat in the future. And that is what our nervous system is designed to do. And our way to work with our nervous system on that is to acknowledge the signal we're receiving from it and then try and manage and resource so that potential futuristic threat doesn't become an active threat. And I think we have to understand what safety looks like and what safety in our brain looks like, for our nervous system looks like, and our body feels like. Safety is super important. I'm not dismissing that. I started this whole episode talking about how much safety comes into the work that I do in the therapy room. And everything is pretty much primed to be about that from the first time I meet with people. But the safety, as our brain understands it, is lack of threat, right? There isn't an active threat to our safety. And safety, our safety there being like, there isn't a threat to our existence, to our being alive in this moment. And so if you're really ahead of where I'm going, you're already like, well, we're constantly under threat then. like true, because we're living in a dystopia. Fact. Yeah, which is why our brain keeps misfiring about so many things, and where I think the historical lens really has to come in. We are dealing with a lot of threats, and our brain is used to those threats. Arguably, the most unsafe thing most of us as people who live in America are doing on a daily basis is driving. It's not safe. It's safe in mass number, but again, the activity that we do most often that is most unsafe is probably driving. Moving in a metal box at 60 plus miles an hour is lethal. Now, have there been modern advances in cars, and like are the amount of lethalities from car crashes going down? Yes. Is every car out on the road built that way? No, because again, we live in capitalist dystopia. So safety measures are not base models, and car companies are not held to any sort of standard that would say, if you could make this safer, you need to. So again, it's very dystopian, even that like I can say the data on this is getting better because cars are getting safer. And also like, we're still not in a society that promotes safety. We're in a society that promotes profit, and that isn't great. But most of us get in our car and do not elicit a response to that threat of, gosh, our skin suit that protects our sensitive organs is traveling at 60 or 70 miles an hour. That might not be safe, right? By and large, we've just learned to either assume or trust our own driving ability, or trust that the box that we're in is safe enough so that we're cool with it. And again, I still get the occasional person who gets really nervous flying and has a specific phobia around that. And it's one of those things where it's like, right, the percentages of safety, even under the modern regime, which is really cutting back on safety protocols. And like, I don't know if y'all remember like the first week of 2025 when Trump took over office, there was like a plane crash every single day as he just gutted like the FAA. Such simpler times we lived in. That has mellowed out, and also like we're still super underserved there, and flying is still way safer than driving is the point I'm building to here. So again, our brain misfires on this. That's like just a really easy go-to example on me, where like our brain's response to it isn't accurate to what the data tells us, and yet most of us are not freaking out about it. And I think that's a really good example, honestly, because when our brain will freak out about it is when we're in a crash. We will often have that trauma response where driving becomes more risky. We're hypervigilant. We don't feel good about driving. We resist driving. We avoid it, right? And so again, like that's a trauma response after we've been in an accident that we have to get there. And the goal isn't then that like in order to be quote unquote safe, we never drive again. The goal is to listen to that response and see where it sort of fits in. We can soothe our nervous system for that big of a response. But I think what keeps happening with modern therapy talk and the way that people are sort of interacting with this concept of safety is anything that makes us feel uncomfortable is treated as that trauma response. And our nervous system being activated isn't necessarily a trauma response. It doesn't need to be. We have this idea now, this branding around therapy of regulated nervous system. And I think too many people think that means we're calm, cool, and collected at all times. And that isn't what our nervous system is designed to do. Our nervous system is designed to ramp up. I'm sort of showing an upward curve as if we were on a line chart, and that curve goes up and then it comes back down. At some point, we reach sort of a critical threat assessment, and then we want to come back down. We want to soothe, we want to comfort, right? And that can take seconds or that could take hours, right? Depending on what the threat is. But the goal is not that we never have any threats. That's comfort. That's not safety, right? Safety is absence of threat. Comfort is never being challenged, never having to even think about a threat or perceive a threat ever again. And like, that's unrealistic. That's just not the world we live in. And that's not what our nervous system is for. Our nervous system is designed to assess threats. The goal isn't to never have threats. The goal is that, oh no, is that going to be a problem? Nah, we're good. Right? Oh no, I have to send this work email and I sent it. oh no, I've set a boundary with my partner and they were super respectful of it. Right? Like the goal is that when we ramp up, we know how to ramp back down. We're both resourced well enough to do that and have the skills and tools we need to be able to do it. And it goes well, right? That's where the discomfort comes, is that acknowledgement that we're not always in control of it the way we would like to be. Setting a boundary is uncomfortable and it is safe. Has the potential to be unsafe if that other person ignores the boundary, right? But like it isn't inherently unsafe. Leaving a bad job, not inherently unsafe. Leaving a bad relationship, not inherently unsafe, right? These are all things that are going to, of course, it makes sense. This is the typical expected outcome. It feels uncomfortable and it's safe, right? Having a disagreement with our partner is safe until it's not, right? And again, when there's raising voices, throwing things, putting hands on each other, as it becomes physical, right? Like the threat assessment needs to go up because that is a threat to our safety. But again, just simply being in disagreement, conversing while having a disagreement, even if it's heated while still being safe, right, is just uncomfortable. The difference between being uncomfortable and being unsafe is significant. And again, too many people are conflating that anytime they're uncomfortable, they're unsafe. And again, that becomes a way to shut down conversation. There's no ongoing learning. There's no communication. And I think that's a problem. But I also think, again, zooming out and looking at like the culture surrounding this, I think that's being sold back to us. Freud was deeply problematic and bad at his job. But Freud, as a person in his time, I don't even want to call him a scientist because he was not doing science, as a societally understood expert of his time, did what too many cis white dudes have done in positions of power and said, this is a problem about you, the individual, not the context surrounding you. And therapy has battled this for a while. Again, we had Freud for a long time, and the people who studied under Freud, and then we had, you know, Carl Rogers and Carl Whitaker and I want to say Fritz. Was it Fritz Perls? Pearls. It's been a long time since I was in grad school. Some of those folks came through with the humanistic movement, and that was better, right? Like that was a lot better than what we got from psychoanalysis and Freud and his various offshoots. And it was still about the person. How do you deal with these problems? How can we help you fix your own problems? And I think I'm biased, right? I think in the 60s, the French philosophers, you know, Foucault, Derrida, a bunch of people in there in the postmodern movement, and simultaneously the cybernetics movement that was studying ecosystems, which would lead to modern technology, but also led to modern family therapy, both sort of coalesced around the idea of like, oh, it's a system, right? And then Foucault still writing like Discipline and Punishment and the Archaeology of Knowledge and some of this stuff was really great. And we had other thinkers that were doing really good work around this time. And so we had things like Fanon and some of his critiques of the systems that were making people unhealthy. But I would never say like that stuff was super mainstream. Even postmodern therapies are not the norm still. While I think postmodernism as a movement was a big deal. Like again, Jordan Peterson made a lot of his career arguing against postmodern thinking while like using postmodern practices himself all of the time. It's an infuriating individual to listen to. But then we had CBT was the big cat's meow in sort of the 80s. And so you had the humanist movement in the 50s, and then in therapy terms, right? And then you had the CBT really became the cat's meow and like is still top dog right? It's what insurance companies like to see. It's what people use. And there are tools and techniques in CBT that are really helpful and work really well. And I think as just a school of thought, it's really stunted. And like it ought to be a toolbox that every therapist has and not its own school of thought. My opinion there. Because there's really good stuff in there, and it's missing a sort of linking ethos into how people move through the world and their environments. And again, most of this stuff has been updated. Nobody's practicing CBT as it existed in the 80s, right? So again, there are these cultural movements, there are these awarenesses that raise not just to pop culture, to non-professional levels, but enter the cultural zeitgeist, enter sort of our day-to-day lingo. And so somatic work and nervous system work and polyvagal theory and trauma have all sort of entered into that space where even if somebody's a hardcore CBT practitioner, they're aware of somatic influences. They're aware of what the nervous system is doing in a way that in the 80s, that was never, ever going to get talked about. But I do think it's the same sort of thing, right? Where CBT became your thoughts, cognitive behavioral therapy. Control your thoughts, you control your behaviors, which like is patently false. We do not control our thoughts. So that's always been a bad thing. That's why I like DBT a lot better than CBT. And the way that I use DBT is also similarly very much a toolbox, while I do feel DBT has a much better ethos surrounding sort of how and why the changes we're making will work. It has a much better world view than CBT. It still is somewhat limited in an individualistic lens. And again, I think if we use that individualistic lens as here are tools and techniques that might help you, the person, navigate your environment and your surroundings, that's great. But again, too many therapists and too many amateur psychologists, people online, content creators are also missing the point that like anything that's packaging up what is happening in our own bodies and selling it back to us as ours to take care of is missing the point. Like that's always been sort of the capitalistic thread through psychotherapy of how do we package this and sell it back to people, and keep them from critiquing the system, keep them from organizing and creating an environment in which they can be healthy. How are we treating symptoms and not the root causes? And again, unfortunately, I think this was another attempt of psychology, of human beings, of healers of all types to course correct the individualistic lens that therapy and other forms of healing were really taking. And now we're back on regulate your nervous system becomes individual work. And anything that makes us feel uncomfortable is therefore unsafe, and we get to shut it down. Again, keeps the work from happening. If you at all engage with organizing or any sort of progressive politics, you know it's messy and that building a coalition is really important. That's how change happens. And that's not by siloing off, right? Siloing off plays into capitalism, plays into fascism's playbook because it's easier to control people and take over, abuse power against people who are siloed off. It's harder to do that for people who are in community. And so these ideas that are about how do you sort of run a marathon instead of a sprint? How do you resource yourself successfully? How do you take the signals from your nervous system? How do you manage and resource yourself so that your nervous system as a tool, as part of your overall body, work in conjunction in the system that you're existing in to not be productive, right? That's what capitalism wants, but to be functional enough to invest in your in your ecosystem. And again, like invest sounds an awful lot like be productive. I was going to say be functional, but again, like I don't love some of that ableist language, and it's the limiting language that we have, where again, like being functional isn't in pursuit of capitalistic ends. It's can you plant your garden? like literally plant a garden or metaphorically like take care of your needs? Can you exist in an environment where other people are helping to meet your needs? Again, can we have an ecosystem that provides actual literal safety? And can we navigate the ups and downs, the bumps, the ebb and flow that go along with potential threats to safety, sometimes even active threats to safety? And can we move through that in a way that isn't debilitating from, again, maintaining that ecosystem that provides safety for us? And again, I think people, what's been sold back to us, unfortunately, is comfort instead of safety. And so when we have things that are uncomfortable for us, we want to withdraw from that. And we've started using the language of safety, of nervous system, of trauma responses as a way to not be uncomfortable. And again, I think that's just really limiting for people. One, from an organizing perspective, but as somebody who's trained in systems theory, in family therapy, couples work, relational work, like, yeah, you're going to be uncomfortable. Everybody's pretty comfortable with language. English just doesn't have enough words. Everybody's very used to, and the cliche carries a lot of weight, or because it's accurate, that relationships is a lot of work, right? We talk about like marriage is a lot of work. People say that all the time, right? Because there's uncomfortable things to work through. There's disagreements. It's not that old school sort of pie in the sky, head in the clouds mentality of like your one true soulmate will be perfect and no work, right? But it's secure attachment, rupture and repair, right? That we can put our foot in our mouth and course correct. To err is human. Making mistakes is a typical and expected outcome. Improving upon those mistakes, learning from the errors we make to make them less or to get rid of them completely is the goal, not to never have mistakes. And so again, with if everything that is uncomfortable makes us feel unsafe, we're A, not doing the work, and B, not building secure attachment, right? Your best friend that you've been friends with since whenever, grade school, high school, whatever, hopefully you've had some bumps and bruises that you've worked through in your relationship where they said something that hurt your feelings and you lost sleep over it and you didn't text them back and blah, 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 blah. And then you talked about it and you understood and they apologized and we all moved on. Uncomfortable work and really important. At no point is that unsafe. Right? We take the threat of losing a relationship as being unsafe, but unless it comes back around to trigger some sort of response that is unsafe, that person is our caretaker. And if they leave us, then we don't have a caretaker. That person is likely to take custody of our kids or is going to burn all our clothes on the front yard or, keeps changing the locks, even though they don't have custody or placement of whatever, right? Like there are things that are behaviors that are unsafe, but just the concept of it, the idea of a relationship shifting or changing parameters is not inherently unsafe. And again, I think that's where we start conflating those things has been really unhelpful. And I don't think that's just like this passive sort of whoops-a-daisy therapy talk going wrong. Like I do think we keep getting sold that. I think it's sort of what happened with grifters coming into wellness spaces. And that's not a new thing. That's historically relevant, probably going back to Freud. But certainly with like capitalism and again, just a lot of like deregulation that happened through Reagan and cutting funding to social services. And again, like we're back on that loop again with another Republican president. Shock. Another person who is not good at politics beyond the fact that they're good at being on TV. Shock. So again, like anything that's putting it back and I think packaging is really important, is where like the capitalism comes in, where it's the packaging that gets then sold back to us. And it's where I don't think therapists have done a good job. And I don't have a solution, right? I'm not over here wagging my finger at everybody and being like, duh, you guys should just be doing this. I also exist under capitalism. If I were to write a book that sold well and gave me financial security, like, yeah, I can sort of see and support therapists, like, get your bag while you can. Like, it's dystopian out there. And it's where, like, yeah, I think putting all of our academic research behind paywalls has been a huge disservice to civilization. I think when we write one book and that becomes our whole career and we tour on it and we speak on it and we never update anything or change anything, and all we're doing is the pursuit of our own financial end goals, that like that also becomes harmful. I don't know why therapists and therapy work isn't free and accessible to people. That's not saying therapy sessions, that's saying, like, I love therapists on Substack. I love therapists who are putting out good information on the internet. I do this podcast for free. My YouTube channel is free. I had a Patreon at one point because I was like, ooh, I should also make money if I can, because again, of the capitalistic mindset of like, you're leaving money on the table. But like, again, that wasn't my pursuit. My pursuit is to put out stuff for free. And again, I don't think that solves anything. While I think those are good ideas and those are values aligned for me personally and work well in the life that I am living, and also in how I do my own finances, how much I charge for a session, how much I bill, and how I sort of do that, how I navigate living under capitalism while being anti-capitalist myself. Again, that doesn't work for everyone. And I don't think that's the be all end all, because again, something like academic research being accessible to people requires a systemic change, right? We need to fund public institutions, and then public institutions don't need to make money off of their research. That's not therapists' job to fix that. That's a systemic issue that needs to be fixed on the systemic level. So, it gets into where our therapists practicing anti-capitalism. It's not by having 1099s. But also, like, anybody who's still, I say anybody, like, gosh, who would be doing this? A ton of people still do this. It's a real problem. Therapists thinking therapy isn't political. Therapists thinking they shouldn't make their politics known. No, like, I do think we as a profession should be on the cutting edge, on the front edge of challenging and pushing for progress, and not just like the bare bones liberal progressive here in America, but like, truly the research says XYZ. That's what we should be pushing for. We should be funding this, and this, because we have a ton of research on it. Most of our societal woes are not unknown question marks. Probably the one that is the scariest right now is climate change. And again, there's a lot we could do to make that better tomorrow that we're just not going to, because of policy, not because the research is not available to us. We have enough food on our planet to feed everyone. Let's make that a priority. We have enough housing on our planet to house everyone. Let's make that a priority. It's doing things for profit that is the problem, of course. I just always move back into the critique of capitalism, because again, like, that's how I'm aligned, and that's what makes sense to me, that like, this is making people sick and it's unnecessary, which is driving people crazy, that like, it doesn't have to be this way. We know that cognitively, and also don't have access to making the changes that we want. So that sucks. And also will it keep me in business for a while, right? Like, it's not that I don't talk about having good job security. I think therapy is worthwhile. And I think therapy that becomes self-serving is problematic in the sense of it's not progressing society. It's not pushing things forward. It's not creating change. It's certainly not revolutionary. And I think that is a problem. Not only is that a missed opportunity, it's an outright problem that therapy is so complacent in that, and often gets co-opted into policing people's existence. And again, that's when we get into like using words like functional and productive in harmful ways, where it's not in our client's best interest. It's in the interest of society. And that society is one that promotes profit over people. And like, therapy shouldn't be a part of that. Therapists themselves shouldn't be a part of that. And so it's it's pushing back on that stuff, certainly, but it's also like throwing our professional weight around. And I will say, on the sort of priority list of who cares about what credentials come after your name, like therapists are near the bottom of that list. Like doctors and lawyers are pretty high. I would say lawyers are stupidly high in our modern dynamic, where like Supreme Court legislates from the bench. Like that's not what is supposed to happen. The idea that like there's checks and balances, part of what is wrong right now is such a rogue legal system. And so I would say lawyers are actually at the top, where we have policy wonks and people who are writing and legislating from the courtroom. They're litigating medical practice, right? I think doctors for a long time were at the top of that list. Medical doctors, MDs, literally with that licensure were at the top. But I do think it's lawyers now. But again, like those groups are up top. I know a ton of great work that medical professionals are doing to raise awareness, to organize, whatever. I don't think general strikes from medical professionals happen nearly enough as to create the change that they want to see, that they know we need. And again, that's not me throwing shade. Again, like these things are really hard to do, and they need to do them. We need to do them if we want the world to be a better place. Again, we need to do the uncomfortable work ourselves as professionals to create a safer environment. I'm really far afield from where I started. But yeah, I mean, like practicing what we preach, certainly. Again, I don't think this is something therapists themselves can fix. I think we as professionals need to be building coalitions. We're siloed, which is how non-professionals like insurance companies and people who have their bachelors in business are wielding more power in our society than all of us professionals combined. So I think building coalitions there and being uncomfortable sometimes, uncomfortable not just in the work we do with clients, but uncomfortable in how we show up in society to make noise and organize and resist some of this stuff should be uncomfortable, because again, we gave up way too much ground, where now it's really hard work and it feels unsafe. And sometimes it might be, again, like certainly protesting, like long history of people driving their cars into protesters, right? The system, capitalism, responds with violence. So there is a time where this stuff does escalate into being unsafe. But again, the idea itself is not unsafe. The behaviors can be unsafe. The idea itself is uncomfortable. And that's the difference we need to be working. And as we scale up and start talking about systemic change, that gets a lot more complex. But in your unhealthy relationship, in asking for a raise, in responding to an email, whatever, those things aren't unsafe. Those things are uncomfortable. And we need to listen to our nervous system. We need to resource our nervous system. We need to let it complete its journey from ramping up to soothing back down. But that's not the be all end all. It's part of the multitude of signals that our body is processing at any given time. Sometimes our system does go into autopilot as a safety mechanism. And again, I think that's a true trauma response. I don't like to attach true to it. It sounds like I'm trying to be the arbiter of what is like an okay response and what isn't. Again, the goal of any of these responses, this is information our body is giving us in real time about the surroundings, about our environment in the moment. And like, yes, we have to learn how to work with that stuff. I'm not suggesting there is a solution to everything. It's not black and white. The point is that there's nuance, and that we have a lot of options available to us because we've learned about ourselves. We've learned about bodies in general. We've learned about the brain, how it works within the body, because it's just part of the body. It's not its own special thing. We learned about our environment. We have tools available to us, right? There's like a lot of things that go into this. And all of that is about existing in our current context. So it's not just we've done our individual work. It's our awareness, our existence, our interaction with our environment, again, in real time. And so I think right now what's been sold back to us, what's being packaged up in therapy speak and taking away the power of how we understand our nervous systems and what our brain and bodies have been designed to do, have evolved to do, is really, really cool, actually. And our system's been hijacked by bad actors, by people in power who want to abuse that system. And so we need to just, again, like, be aware that, like, there's an active process going on the systemic level that is limiting us. And also the people who have created that system own the message machine, the algorithms, and all the feedback loops that we have for some of this stuff. And so our nervous systems feel on fire, and then we're being told to, like, go home and soothe, instead of being like, oh, our nervous system is on fire because, like, we're under the threat of not having enough food because y'all are burning fossil fuels at an irresponsible rate, when there are other alternatives readily accessible. The idea that AI centers need to use fresh water is preposterous. They don't need to exist, first and foremost, and second of all, they do not need water as the only cooling mechanism. It's just what is cheapest. So again, like, our systems are signaling to us that there are problems, and some of them are unsafe, right? And some of them are long-term unsafe, not unsafe in the moment. And it's, again, like, we need to resource so we can work on those things. That potential threat to our safety that we're trying to avoid is a good signal to pay attention to. It's not something we shut our system down for. Our system is being hijacked. It's being, again, the packaging around what is good information around our nervous system, and understanding how we can resource ourselves to run a marathon and not just a sprint, is being packaged back to us in individual work and individual work only. And that's really missing the point. And even, like, my metaphor about running a marathon is like, marathon runners who run, I don't think running marathons is healthy. I don't love this example. Marathon runners don't just run one marathon ever. They're going to run one again in 4 months or in 6 months, or they run one a year or whatever. So again, running a marathon is a metaphor here for, like, living our lives across our lifetime through our different stages of life development. Intergenerational health and safety, wouldn't that be a novelty, instead of just talking about intergenerational trauma? And so we need to resource for an ongoing, continual process, not just one singular stressor, not just one singular cultural battle, but, like, yeah, long-term health, longevity of health and sustainability. Like, when I talk about progress and things, I talk about intensity and frequency, but I also talk about health and sustainability. Is what we're doing healthy? And in a vacuum, a lot of times that's questionable. A lot of people's behaviors are not overtly unhealthy. Again, the context is going to be the driver of whether it's healthy or not. But where a lot of people struggle is sustainability. And where we as a society are struggling right now is sustainability. What we're doing now will not work. It already isn't working. It is at if it continues to limp along like this, there's a lot of harm that's going to be done. And so, uncomfortable or unsafe on the micro level, on an individual level, on a macro level, systemically, we have to be able to work through discomfort and move through that to provide a safer outcome, to make safety, hopefully, sustainable. So, if you're still here, cool. Thanks for hanging out. Sorry about the glitch. Hopefully we can clean that up on our end on the editing. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that means we did it. Hooray! Speaking of we did it. We've got some guests scheduled. They're lined up over the next couple of weeks. I'll be recording with guests again, getting that frequency picked back up for guest episodes. Some of them are therapists. Some of them are special guests who are not therapists, but they're people you might know from something else. That's pretty cool. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to again hit that groove with a bit of me complaining about systems and therapists being bad at systems work, and getting insight from other professionals, from other therapists who have different specialties than I do. So go team. All right, y'all, that's what I got for this week. Take care of yourself. Take care of somebody else. Peace.